Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we're venturing into the darkest corners of America's wilderness, places where the trail ends, the road bends, and the night swallows every sound. I'll be sharing a collection of true encounters and chilling legends from remote mountains, shadowed forests, and lonely backroads across the country. These aren't campfire myths. These are real experiences that linger long after the sun goes down. So grab a blanket, kill the lights, and settle in for a journey where beauty meets terror. Don't forget to subscribe, drop a like, and share your own eerie stories in the comments. Now, let's begin. Story 1: Shadows Beneath the Hayloft. I remember the day I went out to help my uncle clean the old barn at the far edge of his property, though I wish I could forget it entirely. That barn had been abandoned for decades, its roof sagging and walls streaked with the grey and brown of rot, the wood warped by years of wind and rain. I'd never been inside for more than a glance from the lane, and something about stepping through that creaking doorway made me feel like I was intruding on a place that didn't want me there. The first thing that hit me was the smell, a thick, cloying mix of dust, mold, and decay that clung to my clothes and hair. It was the sort of smell that seeps under your skin if you stay too long. My uncle waved it off like it was nothing, joking that I'd get used to it, but I didn't think I ever would. I started stacking hay bales in the center of the barn, working slowly. The sunlight filtered through the gaps in the siding, cutting thin ribbons of light across the floorboards. At first, I thought the movement I kept catching at the edges of my vision was just the shadows shifting with the breeze. But then I noticed it wasn't always in the corners. It was above me, between the beams of the loft. Figures seemed to shift there, too dark to make out, moving in a way that felt almost deliberate. I paused, my hand on a bale of hay, and listened. The faintest whispering reached my ears, like breath across old wood, and the floorboards creaked under steps that weren't mine. My uncle had wandered off toward the back fence, leaving me alone in that uneasy half-light, and I called his name, my voice catching in my throat. Silence answered me. After a while, I forced myself toward the ladder that led into the hayloft. Each rung groaned beneath my weight, and the air grew heavier as I climbed, thick with the scent of rot and something else I couldn't name. The higher I went, the colder it became, though the day outside was warm. By the time I reached the loft, the sun was nearly gone, and the shadows hung like curtains across the rafters. I moved slowly, trying to keep calm, every instinct screaming at me that something was wrong. And then I saw it, a rusted key wedged between two boards as if placed there on purpose. I reached for it, and when my fingers touched the metal, it was warm, oddly warm, as though it had just been handled. I couldn't explain why I felt compelled to take it, but I did, sliding it into my pocket as I climbed down. The whispering had stopped, replaced by a softer, scratching sound that seemed to come from deep in the walls themselves. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I tried to convince myself it was rats or squirrels. But the sounds were too deliberate, moving in patterns that didn't make sense for animals. That night, I slept in the house, the barn looming across the yard like some silent sentinel, its shape barely visible in the moonlight. I thought I could ignore it, but every time I closed my eyes, I imagined movement in the loft, the shadowed forms shifting just beyond the reach of the moon. Sleep didn't come easy, and when it did, it was fitful. I was certain I heard scratching at the windows, soft and patient, as if whatever had been in the loft had followed me inside, waiting for me to rest. I lay awake, listening to the wind in the trees, trying to convince myself it was just that, but the scratches grew closer, deliberate, careful. I felt a cold dread creeping along my spine, the kind that makes the hair on your neck stand up and your stomach twist into knots. I didn't dare get up, not until the sun began to leak weak light across the floorboards. The next day, I went back out to the barn. Uncle had left me alone this time, assuming I'd be working inside. I told myself I'd get the bales stacked and then leave, but as soon as I stepped in, the air felt heavy again, almost sentient. I could feel the barn watching, breathing around me. I climbed the ladder once more, drawn toward the loft by some unreasoning curiosity, and the shadows seemed to shift in greeting. That rusted key burned in my pocket, a constant reminder of the moment I first felt something unexplainable in that space. I explored the loft carefully, scanning the dark corners. My flashlight flickered as I moved, casting long, wavering shadows across the wooden beams. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me, and then, faintly, I heard it again, a soft whisper, so light I thought I imagined it. It seemed to come from all around me at once. I froze, gripping the flashlight tightly, straining to hear more. The whispering grew louder for a heartbeat and then stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so deep it rang in my ears. I backed down the ladder slowly, feeling the presence follow me with each step. By the time I was on the ground, I felt drained, my limbs heavy and stiff. That evening, I tried to ignore it, but the sense of being watched lingered. I kept the key on my bedside table, and at night I would feel it warm in my hand, almost pulsing with some hidden life. The scratching sounds returned in fits, precise and patient, skittering across the walls of the house, sometimes just outside my door. Days passed, and I tried to carry on with life as normal, but the memory of the barn and the loft clung to me. I could picture the figures in the shadows, shifting, watching, patient. I began to avoid the yard at night, avoiding even the view of the barn through the kitchen window. Yet sometimes, when the wind was just right, I could hear faint whispers, low and deliberate, moving across the yard. I never spoke of it to anyone, afraid they'd think me foolish, or worse, that speaking it aloud would draw attention to whatever lingered there. The barn remains, as it always did, across the yard. Uncle still jokes about the need to clean it, but I no longer go inside. I can't explain what I felt in the loft, the warmth of the key, the deliberate scratching and whispers that followed me home. Every time I see the barn, I feel the same cold weight pressing down, as if the shadows themselves are aware of me, waiting. I know it sounds impossible, but I am certain something moved in that loft, watching me, marking me in a way I cannot undo. Even now, years later, the memory lingers like a chill in my bones. I cannot look at barns the same way, cannot walk past that edge of my uncle's property without a shiver. I still dream of the hayloft sometimes, climbing the ladder in the darkness while the shadows shift around me. The key is always there, warm in my hand, and I hear the faint whispers following me down the steps, moving closer with every heartbeat. I never return, but the barn never leaves me. I can feel it in the quiet moments, in the half-light of the house at dusk, in the way the air feels heavier than it should. I do not know what it wants or why it lingered, but I am certain of one thing. It is patient, and it remembers me just as I remember it. Even now, when the wind brushes the trees in a certain way, I hear the faint, deliberate scratching, and I know it is coming from the barn. The sound is slow, precise, and unhurried, as if testing the boundaries of my awareness. I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the warmth of the key pulse beside me, and I realize that some places never release what they hold. They wait, silent, patient, and I am left with the uneasy understanding that the shadows beneath that hayloft will always be a part of me, a memory I cannot escape, a fear I carry quietly through my days and nights. Story 2. The Cornfield at Dusk. I grew up on the edge of our family farm, and the cornfield behind the house was always a place I wandered through when I needed to be alone. The rows stretched far longer than I remembered, twisting in a maze of green and gold that could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. I had spent countless evenings there, chasing fireflies or just letting the tall stalks brush my shoulders, but that particular evening felt different the moment I stepped into the field. The sun was sinking behind the ridges, spilling a copper glow over the land, and suddenly the stalks seemed taller than ever, closing in around me as I walked. The smell of the earth was stronger too, damp and decayed, like something had lain in the soil far longer than it should have. My feet sank slightly into the soft ground, and I felt the quiet thrum of the field pressing all around me, almost alive. I don't know when I first heard the footsteps, but they were soft, deliberate, and not my own. My heart jumped into my throat, and I froze, straining to hear. The sound of my own boots seemed too loud, yet there was another rhythm, offset and slower, moving among the rows. I called out, my voice trembling, but no reply came, just the rustle of cornstalks and the faint crunch of something that shouldn't have been there. I swallowed hard and started walking toward the sound, curiosity wrestling with a deep-seated fear that maybe I was trespassing on something I shouldn't see. The deeper I went, the darker the field became, though the sun was still above the horizon. Shadows stretched long and thin across the ground, and I could feel the stalks pressing closer, brushing against my arms in ways that felt unnatural, as though guiding me forward, or perhaps corralling me. Then I saw it. A figure crouched low between the stalks, its form mostly hidden, but enough to make my stomach twist. It didn't move like a person, its head tilted in a way that seemed off, too sharp, too deliberate. I froze, heart hammering in my chest, and blinked, hoping my mind was playing tricks. When my eyes opened again, it was gone. The air felt heavier where it had been, and the only trace it left behind was a broken scarecrow lying across the stalks, its head cracked, straw spilling onto the ground. My breath came in shallow gasps, and for a long moment, all I could hear was the sound of myself, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. I turned back toward the edge of the field, but every row seemed to stretch farther than before, twisting in ways that defied memory. The sun had dipped lower now, and the shadows between the stalks thickened, dark fingers that reached for me as I stumbled through the narrow paths. I felt eyes on me, everywhere, unseen but unmistakable. I kept telling myself it was just the corn, that the field had grown taller in the fading light, that I was tired and my mind was filling the emptiness with fear. But the sound of soft footsteps, distant and deliberate, continued to follow me. I dared not run. Running would only draw attention. Somehow, I found myself back at the old scarecrow, the one I had passed earlier that evening without a thought. Its tattered clothes flapped gently in the evening breeze. But there was a weight to its presence now, a stillness that felt deliberate. I reached out, touched the broken frame, and the air shifted. I could hear it again then, the soft crunching, the movement among the stalks, but this time it seemed to circle around me, waiting, testing. My chest ached, and I could feel sweat running down my back, not from heat, but from the weight of the dread pressing against me. The sun was gone completely now, and the sky had turned the color of bruised fruit. Darkness pressed in from all sides, and the field became a labyrinth of shadow and stalks. Every step I took echoed too loudly in the thick night, and the faint rustle of movement followed in perfect rhythm, always just behind me, never close enough to see, never far enough to feel safe. I whispered into the darkness, asking whatever was there to leave, telling myself it was a person, a neighbor, a prankster, but no answer came, only the sound of walking, circling, patient. I thought of my family back at the house, imagined the warmth of the kitchen light, but the field would not let me go so easily. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had no meaning in that field. My legs burned, my arms scratched from the corn, and yet I couldn't find the edge. And then I saw the figure again, fleeting, crouched low as before, just beyond a row. I couldn't make out features, only a vague silhouette, human enough to be familiar, wrong enough to send a shiver down my spine. When I blinked, it vanished, leaving nothing but the sound of my own breathing, ragged and uneven in the oppressive night. I began to move, faster this time, breaking through the rows in a desperate bid to escape, but the field seemed endless. Every path led deeper, twisting and turning back on itself, as though the earth had shifted while I wasn't looking. I finally burst through the edge of the cornfield near the back fence, collapsing onto the soft grass, chest heaving, stomach tight with fear. The farm looked peaceful under the moonlight, quiet in a way that made the memory of the field feel like a fevered dream. But the footsteps, the rustling, the feeling of eyes following me, they didn't stop when I left the stalks behind. That night, as I lay in my bed, I could still hear them in the distance, circling the farm, patient, unseen. I imagined the figure crouched somewhere in the dark, watching the house, waiting for the next time I wandered too far. In the days that followed, I avoided the cornfield as best I could. I told myself it was imagination, fatigue, maybe a neighbor playing a prank. But my dreams betrayed me. I dreamed of rows stretching endlessly, shadows shifting, and something crouched, watching, waiting. Sometimes I would wake and swear I heard the soft crunch of footsteps just outside my window, though the yard was empty, the night silent. Every trip past the edge of the field left me tense, my skin prickling with anticipation. I became hyper-aware of every shadow, every rustle of wind in the trees, every brush of something against the fence. I never spoke of what I saw in the cornfield to anyone, and my family never knew. Even now, years later, the memory is as sharp as the day it happened. Whenever I drive past the farm, the rows of corn rising like a wall in the twilight, I feel the same unease, the same weight pressing down on my shoulders. I think about that crouched figure, and I know in my bones that it wasn't human, at least not in the way I understand people. Whatever it was, it has its place there in the field, patient and watchful, and I am just a visitor, an intruder who stumbled into its maze. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the sound of footsteps in the back of my mind, slow and deliberate, moving across some invisible field just beyond the edges of my memory. I can see the stalks, taller than I remember, pressing in around me, shadows twisting in ways that defy explanation, and I remember the broken scarecrow lying across the path, silent and empty, but somehow marking the spot where I came closest to seeing what hides in those fields. There is no comfort, no explanation, only the certainty that some places carry their own watchfulness, that some eyes remain hidden, and that the earth itself can be a labyrinth of things best left unseen. Even now, when I visit the farm in the daylight, the memory of that dusk lingers. The corn grows tall and straight, waving gently in the wind. But in my mind, the rows twist endlessly. The figure crouched low in the shadows, waiting for the next person who wanders too far. I know I am lucky to have escaped with nothing more than fear and memory. But the field keeps its secrets, patient, silent, and I can feel it in the stillness of every evening, in the rustle of leaves, in the stretch of shadows across the ridges. The dread follows me, quiet and insistent, and I know I will never look at a cornfield the same way again. Story 3: The Silent Silo. I remember the first time I noticed the silo behind my neighbor's farm, though I had walked past it countless times without a second thought. It sat off to the side of the field, half swallowed by weeds and the shadows of the surrounding pines. The structure had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, rust staining the metal door, concrete walls cracked and worn, a faint smell of earth and mildew drifting from its open vents. I was 15 at the time. Curious and stubborn, the kind of age where logic is often drowned out by the thrill of exploring places that adults had long since deemed off limits. That evening, the sun was low and the air crisp. The valley below bathed in a dim orange glow. I slipped past the fence and approached the silo, my footsteps silent against the overgrown path, drawn by a strange mix of fascination and unease. Inside, the air was thick, almost metallic, carrying a scent of rust, damp, concrete, and something I couldn't identify. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the near darkness, illuminating the circular walls and the ladder that spiraled upward. The concrete seemed to stretch infinitely, the shadows pooling in deep corners that my light couldn't reach. That's when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible hum. At first I thought it was the wind, a draft whistling through cracks in the walls, but as I listened it became something more, a melody almost like a song. Distant yet insistent, rising and falling in a rhythm that felt deliberate. I swallowed hard, a chill running down my spine. There was no one around, and yet the sound seemed to be just behind me, brushing against my ears like a whisper I couldn't place. I climbed the ladder slowly, the metal rungs cold and slick beneath my fingers. Each step brought me closer to the top, and with each step, the humming grew louder, more distinct, yet still impossibly faint, like it was threading through the air itself. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the shadows at the top of the shaft. My heart leapt, and I froze, listening to the low vibration of the sound reverberating through the walls. It was almost a whisper now, circling me in the tight space of the silo, intimate and pressing. I leaned closer to the wall, trying to see where it came from, and that's when I noticed the carvings, faded scratches, symbols or letters long erased by time, etched into the concrete at eye level. Some looked like words, though I couldn't make sense of them, while others were jagged, almost abstract, but clearly deliberate. A shiver ran through me. My flashlight flickered again, the beam swinging across the curved walls, and the humming seemed to respond, growing louder for a heartbeat, then softer, like breathing in the dark. My chest tightened, my palms slick with sweat as I gripped the ladder. Every instinct screamed at me to climb down, yet I felt rooted, my curiosity locking me in place. I climbed another few rungs, edging closer to the top of the silo, expecting to emerge and see the valley spread out beneath the fading light. But the ladder opened into emptiness, a hollow shaft that dropped farther than I could see, shadows pressing in from every side. I leaned against the railing, the humming now just behind my ear, and I realized the sound wasn't coming from the outside. It was inside, almost alive, vibrating through the walls, twisting with every breath I took. I backed down slowly, rung by rung, trying to put distance between myself and whatever presence had made the hum. The concrete walls seemed to close in, and the beam of my flashlight bounced erratically, illuminating only the nearest rungs and the curve of the shaft. The symbols and scratches seemed to move in the flickering light, shadows bending across them as if they were shifting beneath the surface. My stomach twisted with a rising panic, and every instinct told me to turn and run. Yet as I descended, the humming followed, circling and curling around the ladder, close enough to feel brushing my skin, teasing the edge of my mind with some unplaceable familiarity. When I finally reached the bottom, my legs trembling, I stumbled back into the open air. The hum stopped instantly, leaving a silence that pressed against my ears, deafening in its absence. The cool evening air never felt so heavy. The chirp of crickets and the rustle of the fields surrounding the silo loud in contrast to the oppressive quiet I had left behind. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hands shook as I pushed the door closed, sliding the rusted latch across it, though I knew it would do nothing to contain whatever had been inside. That night, and for several nights afterward, I couldn't escape the memory. I would lie awake, and the sound would echo in my head, faint at first, then growing stronger, until it seemed to curl through the house itself. I heard it in the walls, in the vents, even under my bed, a soft, melodic hum, too quiet to place but impossible to ignore. Sleep became shallow, dreams fractured by the sound, always leading back to the silo, back to the top of the ladder, back to the carvings in the walls that no one else would see. I began to avoid the neighbor's property altogether, walking wider paths in the fields and avoiding the silo entirely. Yet the memory lingered in every shadow, every corner of the valley below. I never spoke of what I heard to anyone, not even my parents. How do you explain a hum that isn't music, a presence that leaves no trace, a place that seems ordinary in daylight, but suffocates you in twilight? Even now, years later, when I pass that silo on the road, I feel the pull of it, the sense that it is waiting, patient, unchanged, and ready to resume its song when no one is watching. My imagination tries to offer explanations, wind, old metal, memory, but none of them account for the intimacy of the sound, the way it seemed to follow me up and down that ladder, threading through my mind long after I left. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear it faintly, a low, curling hum just beyond awareness, coaxing memories of the curved walls and the symbols carved into the concrete. The air feels thicker in my chest, and my skin prickles in the memory of its presence. I know I will never step inside that silo again, yet I also know that it will never truly leave me. The silence that followed me home was unbearable, lingering in every quiet corner, in every room where the night was too still, in every creak of old boards and whisper of wind. The memory is more than just fear. It is a reminder that some places in the world carry themselves in a way that defies reason, and some sounds once heard cannot be forgotten. I cannot explain why the humming was there, or what those carvings meant. Sometimes I convince myself that it was a trick of the mind, the power of imagination in a dark, enclosed space. Other times I remember the intimacy of it, the way it pressed against me, following every step, responding to the flashlight beam, and I know that there was something there that wanted to be noticed, something patient and careful and unrelenting. The memory has stayed with me, a quiet, insistent weight. A hum threading through the air whenever I stand still long enough to hear it. I think about it often, and the longer I live, the more I understand that some things in the mountains, in the fields, in abandoned structures exist quietly, in a way that doesn't announce itself but refuses to leave. Even today, when the wind moves through the trees and the valley is calm, I feel the pull of that silo, the memory of the ladder, the shadows, the carved walls, and the hum behind my ear is indelible. It reminds me that some places are patient, waiting for someone to climb the steps again, waiting for someone to hear what is never meant to be heard. I never will, I tell myself, and yet in the stillness of evening, I know I can hear it again, faint but deliberate, threading through the dark spaces that separate memory from reality, a sound that belongs to the silo and nothing else, leaving me with a lingering unease that I will carry for the rest of my life. Story 4: Lantern Light on the Ridge. I remember walking home along the ridge that runs behind my family's property, the sun already dipping below the distant ridges, leaving the valley below swallowed in the muted colors of twilight. The path was familiar, lined with scrub pines and the occasional gnarled oak, the ground uneven and littered with stones, but that evening it felt different. There was a weight to the air, a stillness that made each footfall sound unnaturally loud. I had been out longer than I realized, losing track of time as I wandered, and the fading light cast long, restless shadows across the ridge. That's when I saw it, a lantern swinging slowly in the distance, just above the tree line. At first, I thought it must be someone hiking the ridge, perhaps a neighbor or another traveler, but something about the movement didn't feel right. It wasn't steady, as a person's swing would be, but too fluid, too deliberate, like it was floating in the air on its own accord. As I moved closer, the outline of a figure holding the lantern became faintly visible. It swayed gently, side to side, like a sapling in a breeze, though I could see no wind disturbing the ridge. My curiosity pushed me forward, though every instinct in my body told me to turn and head back toward the valley. The lantern's light flickered erratically, casting long, spindly shadows across the ground. Twisting them toward me as if they were reaching, I called out, my voice breaking in the cool air, asking if anyone was there, but no reply came. The figure did not move closer or retreat. It simply swayed in the same unnatural rhythm, holding the lantern high, its flame defying the wind, or rather, seeming to ignore the lack of wind entirely. My steps slowed as I neared, the uneven ridge forcing me to focus on my footing. The air seemed heavier, pressing against my chest, and the familiar scent of pines was overlaid with something else. Smoke, faint and acrid, and the coppery tang of something metallic. The closer I got, the more I realized that the figure didn't look human, at least not entirely. Its head hung slightly too far forward, the shoulders slumped in a way that suggested exhaustion or deliberate posture, and the lantern it held flickered with a strange consistency, never guttering with the occasional gust of air. Shadows spilled from the lantern, stretching unnaturally, writhing over the ground like dark fingers, extending further than the light should allow. I hesitated for a moment, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Something about the sight made my skin crawl. I wanted to retreat, to leave the ridge and the strange light behind, but an inexplicable pull urged me forward, curiosity threading through my fear. Step by step, I moved closer, listening to the uneven crunch of my boots against the ridge, the distant call of a bird somewhere below the trees, and the soft sway of the figure. Then, without warning, the lantern's flame flared suddenly, sending the shadows dancing across the ridge like living things. I blinked, and the figure was gone. My heart hammered, and I froze, scanning the ground where it had stood, but all I could see was the lantern lying on the earth, smoldering faintly as if it had never been held at all. The sight left me rooted in place. The flame cast a pale orange glow across the rocks and dirt, but there was no figure, no footprints, nothing to indicate that anyone or anything had been there. I bent down cautiously, hands trembling, and touched the lantern. It was cold to the touch, though faint smoke curled lazily from the metal top, as though it had been abandoned only moments ago. The ridge was silent, save for the distant rustle of trees and the steady beat of my own heart. I couldn't make sense of it. The figure's disappearance too clean, too complete. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run down the ridge and back to the familiar safety of home, yet I couldn't tear my eyes from the lantern, as if it held the answers I didn't dare speak aloud. I picked it up carefully, cradling it as I turned to make my way home. Every shadow along the ridge seemed to twist and stretch toward me now, the fading light playing tricks on my eyes. The path I had walked countless times felt unfamiliar. The familiar markers of trees and rocks bending subtly, impossibly in the dim light. I forced myself to keep moving, the lantern smouldering faintly in my hands, and tried to convince myself that the figure had been some stranger, perhaps a hiker who had vanished into the twilight before I could reach them. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something about the movement, the unnatural sway, the impossible shadows. It had been wrong in a way I couldn't explain, and that wrongness lingered in the air around me. By the time I reached the edge of the ridge where the path leveled out toward the valley, darkness had fully settled. The lantern's light barely pierced the gloom, yet even in the small glow, I could feel the shadows pressing closer, brushing against my legs and arms, curling around the uneven stones as if they remembered the figure that had vanished. I hurried the last stretch, the air growing colder, and finally reached the edge of the forest that bordered the road home. There, at last, I dared to glance back. The ridge was empty, only the soft sway of tree branches in the wind. No figure remained, no lantern, nothing that could explain the strange pull of the evening. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the swaying figure, the lantern casting shadows that twisted impossibly, curling toward me even when I was safe in my bed. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams of the ridge, the soft flicker of the flame, and the unrelenting pull of those shadows. Even in daylight, whenever I walked near the ridge, I felt the same weight, the sense that someone, or something, was still out there, waiting, patient, unseen, observing every step I took. I never returned to the ridge at night after that, and the lantern was gone the next morning, as if it had been a phantom all along. The memory, however, lingered. I could picture the way the shadows had stretched, the sway of the figure that wasn't quite human, and the smouldering lantern, abandoned yet somehow alive in my mind. It became impossible to walk along the ridge without feeling that same unease pressing against me, a quiet dread that no rational explanation could erase. Every rustle of the trees, every sway of branches in the wind felt laden with meaning, as though I was never truly alone, even in broad daylight. Years later, I still think about that night, the figure swaying gently, the flame casting impossible shadows, and the strange pull that kept me moving closer even as every instinct warned me away. I know I was lucky to return at all, yet I also know that whatever it was, it remains there, somewhere along the ridge, patient and deliberate, waiting for the next person to wander too far into its sway. Sometimes, when the wind carries just right through the treetops, I swear I can see a faint flicker in the distance, the briefest glimmer of light, and I feel the same cold knot of fear in my stomach. I will never walk that ridge again after dusk, and yet the memory has taken root, a quiet terror I carry with me, a reminder that some places, some moments, remain haunted even when no one is there to witness them. Story 5. Whispering Pines. At midnight. I remember the night clearly, though it's been years since that stretch of pines swallowed me whole. I had set up camp near the edge of a narrow ridge where the trees were older, taller than most I'd ever seen, their needles whispering in the slightest wind. The forest had been quiet all evening, the crackle of my fire and the occasional rustle of small animals, the only interruptions to the calm. I fell asleep, thinking nothing more than the usual. The stars overhead, the smell of damp earth, the way the ridge overlooked the valley below. I had no idea that night would twist into something I couldn't explain, something that still makes my skin crawl at the memory. I woke suddenly, the kind of waking that doesn't let you linger in dreams, to a sound that didn't belong. At first, it was faint, like the wind brushing the pines in a peculiar rhythm, but then I realized it wasn't wind at all. It was whispering, soft, drawn out, almost sibilant, and it carried words I thought I knew but didn't at the same time. My heart thumped in my chest when I recognized my name. Not shouted, not called, but murmured in a chorus of voices that seemed to come from every direction all around the camp, yet no single source. The way it reached me felt intimate, like someone or something knew me, had been watching me, and now wanted me to hear them. I fumbled for my flashlight, hands shaking. The cold sweat of fear making the fabric of my shirt cling uncomfortably to my back. When I stepped out of my tent, the night hit me in waves, thicker, heavier than before. The pines were no longer simply trees. They had turned into a forest of leaning shadows. Branches stretched in impossible angles, and the trunks seemed to sway independently of the wind, bending toward me as if their movement were purposeful, deliberate. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but it only served to deepen the shadows, revealing shapes that weren't there a moment ago and disappearing when I tried to focus on them. I tried calling out, my voice cracking. "Hello? Is someone there?" The whispers paused, replaced by a silence so sudden it pressed against my ears like a physical weight. And then they started again, louder now, overlapping voices forming a tangled web of speech. I couldn't make sense of the words, only fragments. My name, a warning, something like laughter or sobbing. It didn't matter if they were real or imagined. My body reacted like they were. I wanted to turn back to the tent, to leave, but my feet moved forward before my mind could catch up. There was a pull, subtle yet irresistible, leading me deeper into the line of pines. The ground beneath my boots was soft from recent rain, the needles damp and clinging. As I walked, I noticed footprints appearing in the earth, fresh and dark against the lighter mud. I hadn't seen anyone come this way. They were human, or at least they resembled human prints. But the spacing, the direction, it was unnatural. The path curved in tight circles, looping back on itself in ways no normal walker could follow. Each time I thought I'd reach the end, the footprints would guide me back, coaxing me further into the forest. I felt the whispering brushing past the edge of my consciousness, insistent, urging, almost delighted. At one point, I stumbled over a gnarled root and nearly fell. My flashlight flickered, threatening to die in my trembling hands, and in that moment of darkness, the forest seemed to breathe around me. The air was heavy with the scent of wet pine and something else. Earthy, almost sweet, a hint of decay beneath it. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, a trick of isolation and nerves, but the footprints in front of me didn't lie. They led to a clearing I hadn't noticed before, surrounded on all sides by trees so dense their tops blocked the moonlight entirely. The whispers converged here, rising and falling like waves, their pitch unsettling, impossible to ignore. In the clearing, the ground was churned as if something had paced there for hours. The footprints ended abruptly at the center, and for a moment, I thought I might be safe. But then the whispers stopped. Complete silence settled in the clearing like a shroud. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't move. It was the quiet that terrified me, more than any voice, more than any shadow. The darkness seemed alive, shifting subtly, and I caught glimpses out of the corner of my eye, movement that was never quite there when I looked directly. Something small, perhaps human, perhaps not, darted just beyond the tree line, vanishing before I could understand it. I turned to leave, telling myself I'd make it back to the tent, to the fire, to sanity itself. But as I stepped, the soil beneath my foot squelched unnaturally, and I looked down to see footprints that weren't mine, dark, wet impressions forming around me as though the forest itself had made them. They weren't organized in any way I could comprehend. Some led toward me, some away, some circled back on themselves. And there, in the mud, I saw them, tiny handprints, smeared and faint, as if something had grasped the earth and pressed its fingers into it with desperate intent. I felt eyes on me then, not human eyes, or perhaps human eyes with a hunger I didn't want to understand. The whispers returned, low now, teasing, not calling my name, but murmuring something I could not translate, like secrets meant only for the pines. Panic overtook me. I stumbled back toward the path, following the footprints that seemed to move in opposition to my own. The trees leaned closer, their shadows stretching impossibly long, brushing my arms and shoulders, leaving wet impressions on my skin. I heard a soft rustle behind me, something creeping over the damp needles. I dared not look back, fearing the sight of a face, or worse, something that couldn't be a face. The whispers grew again, a chorus of hissing, sighing voices that seemed to circle me, pressing against my ears from all directions. I ran then, limbs burning, heart hammering, the flashlight swinging wildly, illuminating only fragments of the forest. One moment a patch of mud, the next a twisted tree, a glint of white that might have been a face, might have been a reflection of my own fear. The clearing receded slowly as I sprinted back toward the ridge. The whispers became indistinct, fading with the distance, leaving only an echo of dread that followed me even after I'd broken into open ground. I never saw the footprints again, though I checked the path at dawn. It was as if the forest had swallowed them, erased them from memory. But I remembered. I still remember. And I remember the pull, the undeniable lure of those whispering pines, the way they almost made me stay. Something had been there, and it had wanted me to see, to follow, to step into its circle. When I finally collapsed back at the tent, the sun breaking through the tree line, I tried to shake the terror from my body. I told myself I had imagined it, that exhaustion, isolation, and shadows had conspired to frighten me. But even as I packed up and left, I felt that lingering weight, the sensation that the pines were watching, waiting. Every night since, when the wind whistles just right through the trees near my home, I swear I hear those whispers again, calling me, urging me to return. And though I know I will not, I cannot rid myself of the memory, the imprint of the forest pressing against the edge of reason, leaving me with a knowledge I cannot name, and a fear I cannot erase. The ridge is quiet now, the campsite abandoned, the footprints gone. But somewhere in that line of pines they remain, waiting, watching, and I know without a doubt that they would call me back if I ever let my curiosity wander too far into the night. Story 6. The Barn Door That Cried. I remember the first time I heard it, though I'd been past that barn countless times before without a second thought. It stood at the edge of Miller's old property, leaning slightly to one side like it was holding its breath. The boards were grey and weathered, warped by decades of rain and snow, and the roof sagged in the middle. I was taking the back path from my cousin's place, the one that cut through the ridge behind his farm, hoping to reach my own cabin before the sun disappeared completely behind the hills. The air was crisp, sharp with the scent of pine and decaying leaves, and I was half listening to the rustle of squirrels in the brush when I heard it, a soft, unmistakable crying. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe a deer hurt somewhere, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. It had that tremble you hear in someone trying not to let their panic break through, and as I froze on the path, the sound grew clearer. It was coming from the barn. My stomach twisted as my curiosity pulled me forward against the better judgment I could feel gnawing at me. Each step on the uneven trail seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. The barn sat in a small clearing, surrounded by pines that whispered and shifted with a wind I couldn't feel, casting elongated, twitching shadows across the ground. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, trying to rationalize the noise. Maybe some kid had gotten lost in the woods, or an animal had caught its reflection in the broken windows. Yet, every logical thought I forced into my head was met with that unmistakable sound. Soft, hiccuping sobs, rising and falling like they were trying to carry a secret. My pulse quickened. I reached out and pressed my ear against the rough, splintered boards of the barn wall. The crying didn't stop. If anything, it shifted slightly, as though it knew I was listening. Hesitation gripped me, but the whisper of curiosity edged out my fear. I circled the barn slowly, tracing my fingers over the cracks in the wood, the dry rot that flaked into my palms. Somewhere in the shadows, the sobs seemed to shift from side to side, teasing me, refusing to be pinned down. I realized the door was slightly ajar, swinging ever so gently as though moved by a hand I couldn't see. The urge to retreat warred with the compulsion to understand what I was hearing. I pushed it open. The hinges groaned. A low protest that seemed louder than it had any right to be in the quiet woods. Inside, the barn smelled of old hay, damp earth, and something I couldn't name. Something metallic, almost coppery. Dust motes floated in the narrow beams of fading light. My flashlight barely cut through the gloom, flickering as if uncertain about the truths it might reveal. The crying continued, now rising from the rafters, echoing off the high beams in a pattern that made no sense. It wasn't coming from a corner or a shadowed nook. It was everywhere at once, surrounding me, threading through the air like smoke. My legs felt leaden as I moved slowly toward the center, scanning the floor for signs of life. Nothing but empty stalls, a few rusted tools, and the smell of damp wood. I whispered into the silence, asking if anyone was there, my voice trembling despite myself. The crying paused for a heartbeat, and in that pause, my own heartbeat thundered so loud it nearly drowned out everything else. Then it returned, softer, closer, as if brushing the edges of my mind. I backed away toward the door, the floorboards creaking beneath me, each step making me more aware of how alone I was. The light from my flashlight caught something on one of the walls, scratch marks, deep and deliberate, like someone had clawed at the wood, desperate to leave a message I couldn't decipher. But there was no one there, only shadows that twisted unnaturally as the light passed over them. I wanted to run, but my feet felt heavy, rooted by a mixture of dread and morbid fascination. The cries seemed to follow me wherever I went, moving with a life of their own. I glanced toward the loft, where the beam of my flashlight caught the curve of a ladder. Against every instinct, I climbed it, the wood groaning under my weight, echoing into the emptiness above. The space was narrow and lined with cobwebs, dust thick enough to taste. I shined my light into every corner, my chest tight, expecting to see some explanation. A trapped animal, a hidden person. Nothing. Then, as I stood there, my back pressed against the cold wood of the loft wall, I heard it more clearly than ever. A whisper, so close I felt the heat of the breath on my neck. It was not crying now, just a soft, ragged voice, low and almost intimate. It said my name, my actual name. The sound of it, spoken from somewhere I could not see, made my stomach flip and my mouth go dry. I turned quickly, swinging the flashlight, but there was nothing but the shifting shadows of the loft beams. I stumbled back, disoriented, slipping on the scattered hay, my heart hammering. Every instinct screamed to flee, but something deeper, something that felt like the same force that had drawn me forward in the first place, kept me frozen, trying to rationalize the impossible. The crying returned, but now it was accompanied by something else. The faint, dragging sound of movement across the floor below, just behind the wall. My mind raced through possibilities, none of them comforting. No animal could make that sound. No sane person would choose to hide in a place like this without reason. Then, suddenly, The sobbing stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with anticipation. My ears rang, trying to catch the echo of something I couldn't name. I pressed my back to the wall, fighting the urge to collapse, and listened. The shadows seemed to lean closer, drawn in by the absence of sound, and in that moment I felt utterly, profoundly watched. I don't know what made me turn back, to descend the ladder with trembling hands. The boards felt slick with unseen moisture, every creak sounding like a scream. By the time I reached the barn floor, the dim twilight had almost vanished, leaving only the faint glow of the last evening light through the broken windows. I took a step toward the door and froze. There, on the threshold, lay a faint outline of footprints in the dust. They weren't mine, not entirely. They were too delicate, uneven, as though someone small had moved quickly in the dark, dancing across the floor. My pulse spiked and I bolted outside. The instant I cleared the threshold, the crying ceased. The wind through the trees whispered gently, mocking me with its ordinary sound. For a moment, I thought it was over. I leaned against the barn, gasping, trying to catch my breath, and the unease settled like a stone in my chest. The shadows outside seemed calm, natural, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had slipped past me, watching from somewhere hidden. I didn't stop running until I reached the ridge path, the hills stretching endlessly ahead, darkening with night. Even then, the sound of the crying lingered in my ears, overlaid on every rustle of leaves, every shifting shadow. For days afterward, I felt its presence, a phantom weight pressing at the edges of sleep. I avoided that path for weeks, my curiosity replaced by a gnawing, restless fear. And yet, I knew I would return, because part of me needed to understand what had called my name in that barn, and part of me dreaded the answer I might finally see. Even now, when the wind presses against the cabin walls, I swear I hear it again, faint and almost tender, a sound I cannot place. The barn remains in my mind as though it exists somewhere beyond the ridge, waiting for someone else to listen closely enough to hear what should not exist, to feel what I felt, to wonder if they were ever truly alone. And I know that one day, if I am careless or curious enough, the crying will find me again, pulling me back to the grey boards, the dust, the shadows, and the unbearable knowledge that some things in the forest are never meant to be seen or heard. But they will always be there, just out of reach, just beyond understanding. The memory of it clings to me like cobwebs in the corners of a dark room, persistent, inescapable. I can't explain it, and perhaps no one could, but I know it is real. The barn, the whispering, the cry, it all existed, and it waits. I carry it with me in the quiet hours when the wind shifts, when the night deepens, when the trees whisper their secrets, and the dread of returning, of hearing my name called from within walls that should have been empty, is a weight that will never lift. Even now, years later, I cannot walk past that ridge without looking toward the old Miller barn. I can't help myself, and sometimes, in the farthest reaches of the night, I swear I hear it again, soft and distant, carried on the wind, a reminder that the forest does not forgive curiosity, and some cries are meant to echo forever. Story 7. Fields, frozen in moonlight. I remember that night as if it had pressed itself into my very bones, every detail etched with the cold, silver light of the full moon. I had been walking home from my friend's cabin, the familiar dirt path winding through the outskirts of the fields that bordered the edge of our valley. It was late, later than I usually dared to be outside, but the moon hung so perfectly above the hills that I had allowed myself a lingering glance at the night. The air was still, too still, and there was a peculiar clarity that made the ordinary world feel sharper. Every stalk of grass, every ridge of the soil unnervingly defined in the pale light. As I walked, my boots crunching on the frost-hardened earth, I noticed it, a subtle anomaly in the vast expanse of the field beside the path. At first, I thought it was a trick of my eyes, perhaps the gleam of frost catching the moonlight unevenly. But as I slowed my pace, heart tightening, it became undeniable. Every plant in that stretch of field was frozen, rigid as if some invisible hand had stopped time itself. Cornstalks, wheat, the low brush that usually bent and swayed with the night breeze, all stood stiff, their shadows long and taut across the ground. The silence hit me like a physical weight, pressing down with a heaviness that made my chest ache. Normally, the field would be alive with night sounds, rustling leaves, the distant cry of an owl, the low hum of the wind over the hills. But that night, there was nothing. No sound, not even the subtle whisper of my own movement through the frost. My skin prickled with unease, the hair on my arms rising as I realized how unnatural it all felt. Something was out there, moving, and it was deliberate. I couldn't see it at first, only sense it, the way a presence can make the air seem thicker, more oppressive. My steps faltered, the path beneath my feet seeming impossibly narrow. Constricted by the frozen tableau on either side, I told myself it was nothing, probably just a trick of the moonlight, a trick of exhaustion. But then, something shifted just beyond the silver glow. A shape, or maybe a shadow, slid among the frozen stalks, moving slow, deliberate, like a hand brushing over the field, testing, observing. My heart pounded so hard I feared it might give me away. A human sound in a place that should not have had any life. The presence was invisible, but I felt it in every nerve ending, every shiver crawling along my spine. I wanted to run, but the sight held me fast, a grotesque fascination that refused to release its grip. My mouth was dry, my breath forming small clouds in the icy night air, and each exhalation seemed to echo across the frozen expanse. I stepped closer, careful not to make a sound that would betray me, and the frozen plants remained motionless, yet the sense of being watched grew unbearable. My instinct screamed to turn back, to flee to the warmth and familiarity of the cabin lights down the road, but something gnawed at the edges of my curiosity. I had to see it, had to understand what it was, even though every instinct told me to do the opposite. The moonlight made the field look almost dreamlike, surreal in its perfection, yet every fiber of my being recognized the wrongness of it, the unnaturalness of frozen life paired with the deliberate, unseen motion. Then I saw it, or thought I did, a shimmer, subtle, like a ripple across the air, just beyond the furthest stalks I could see. It moved again, slower this time, deliberate, almost conscious, and for a brief moment I felt the cold grip of true fear. It was not human, not entirely, but it was intelligent. I could sense the calculations behind its movement, the almost deliberate malice that seemed to brush past me with each subtle shift. My pulse raced, my legs trembling, yet I could not tear my eyes away. I tried to make out a figure, a form, anything that could explain the impossibility of what I was witnessing, but the field offered nothing. I remember thinking, in that terrible clarity, that if I moved too fast, I might vanish into whatever presence lingered there. The air itself felt heavier, denser, filled with a tension that pressed against my ribs. A noise finally reached my ears, faint but unmistakable, the soft, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps. Though no footprints marked the frozen ground, Each step echoed in the silence, deliberate, circling as if the field itself had a consciousness, playing some cruel game with me. My legs gave way under the weight of panic, and I stumbled back toward the path, eyes never leaving the unnatural field. I ran, the frozen plants brushing against my shoulders, the night air biting at my face, and yet I couldn't escape the feeling that it followed, patient, deliberate, never hurrying, just always there. The moon shone overhead, indifferent to my terror, illuminating the landscape in cruel detail. Even as I reached the edge of the field and burst onto the path, the image of the frozen crops stayed with me, vivid and haunting. Each stalk, each shadow, imprinted into my memory, replaying itself whenever I closed my eyes. By the time I reached the first lights of the distant cabins, my body was shaking uncontrollably, my mind caught between disbelief and fear. I tried to explain it to myself in rational terms, frost patterns, illusions of the moonlight, fatigue, but none of it fit. The field had been too uniform, too deliberate, and the presence had been real, too conscious to dismiss. That night, sleep eluded me, the memory of motionless life under an uncaring moon replaying endlessly, each replay as vivid as the moment it had occurred. Over the following days, I found myself avoiding that path, taking longer routes through familiar woods. Yet the memory followed, persistent and unyielding. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I could swear I heard the same deliberate movement beneath the frozen stillness, faint as a whisper, a reminder that it had not been imagination, that the presence had not left me. The sensation of being watched, of being tested, lingered in my chest, an unshakable weight. Friends asked why I had suddenly changed my routes, why I avoided that ridge, but I could not put into words what I had seen. Even now, writing this, I struggle to capture the fear, the utter impossibility of that frozen field and the deliberate motion threading through it. I returned once, weeks later, under the same full moon, hoping for some rational explanation, hoping to convince myself that it had been a trick of the light, a fevered imagination. But the field was there, rigid and silent, unchanged yet somehow more menacing in its perfection. I saw no movement that night, but the same oppressive weight pressed against me, the same sensation that something intelligent, something patient lingered just beyond sight. I left without looking back. My steps hurried, every nerve on edge, every shadow stretching into shapes I dared not name. Even now, months later, I cannot forget that night. The image of the frozen field under moonlight, the deliberate presence threading through motionless crops, haunts me in quiet moments. It replays in the corners of my vision when I walk alone, when the wind is still, when the world should feel safe. I know I was not imagining it. The fear was too raw, too detailed, too precise. And though I have told myself countless times that it is behind me, that it was just a trick, the memory is a weight I carry, a constant reminder that some part of that ridge remains untouched by time, and that whatever watched me that night continues to exist, patient, deliberate and unseen, beneath the unblinking gaze of the uncaring moon. I cannot explain why it happened, nor why I survived to tell of it, nor why the field still calls to me in the darkest hours. But the truth remains. Something moved in that frozen space, something that I will never see clearly, something whose presence I will never forget. And sometimes when the wind dies and the world goes quiet, I feel it again, deliberate and patient, just beyond the edge of vision, reminding me that the field was never truly empty, and that I was never truly alone.